stop right now. What I'm about to show you in the next few minutes could completely change your understanding of the money in your wallet. Every government promises its money is safe. Every Treasury Secretary swears the system is sound. But they're all hiding the most audacious financial trick ever conceived. In 10 minutes, you'll discover how the United States performs a financial magic trick so elegant that most people never understand they're watching the greatest magic act in economic history, and why this trick could destroy everything at any moment. The United States doesn't just print money when it needs cash. It performs a shell game so perfect, so perfectly orchestrated, that most people never realize what's happening right under their noses. The trick is simple. America buys its own debt. And the reason this matters isn't just academic theory. This is the foundation holding up everything you think you know about money. And that foundation is cracking at the seams. When people imagine government borrowing, they picture foreign creditors or wealthy investors buying treasury bonds, China holding American debt, pension funds parking money in safe securities, banks storing reserves in government paper. That's part of the story. But it's not the whole story. The real story is stranger, more circular, and far more dangerous than anyone wants to admit. Because buried inside the Federal Reserve's balance sheet is a secret that would make any other institution guilty of fraud. The U.S. government doesn't just borrow money. It creates the money it borrows from itself. Here's how the trick works. When Congress decides to spend more than it collects in taxes, the Treasury Department issues bonds. These are IOUs promising to pay back the money with interest. Now, in theory, these bonds get sold to investors who hand over real cash in exchange for the promise of future payments. But there's a problem. Sometimes there aren't enough investors willing to buy all the bonds the government needs to sell. Sometimes interest rates would have to rise to levels that would crush the economy. Sometimes the appetite for government debt just isn't there. That's when the Federal Reserve steps in. The Fed, which is technically independent but practically joined at the hip with the Treasury, simply creates new money out of thin air and uses it to buy the government's bonds. No investors needed, no real savings required, just digital entries in a computer system that transform debt into currency with the click of a mouse. The government issues the bond. The Fed buys the bond. And suddenly money exists where none existed before. Think about what just happened. The Treasury says it needs $1 billion. It prints up a bond promising to pay back $1 billion plus interest. The Federal Reserve says it will take that bond and hands over $1 billion freshly created dollars. The Treasury now has money to spend. The Fed now owns a piece of paper promising future payments. But here's the key part. Both institutions are ultimately controlled by the same government. It's like writing yourself a check and then depositing it in your own account. This isn't theory. This is documented policy that happens every single day. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, which you can look up right now, shows trillions of dollars in government securities. Those aren't bonds they bought from private investors. Those are bonds they purchased directly or indirectly from the Treasury using money that didn't exist until the moment they decided to buy them. It's the most sophisticated form of money printing ever devised, disguised as normal market operations. And if you're holding dollars, this directly affects you. The scale of this operation is staggering. During the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet exploded from less than $1 trillion to over $4 trillion. During the COVID pandemic, it ballooned again, reaching nearly $9 trillion. Each expansion represented the Fed creating new money to buy government bonds, corporate debt, and mortgage securities. Each time, the justification was crisis management. Each time, the result was the same. More money chasing the same amount of goods, services, and assets. But the bond trick goes deeper than emergency spending. It's become the normal way the system operates. When the government spends money on defense, infrastructure, or social programs, it doesn't wait for tax revenues to cover the costs. It issues bonds, knowing the Federal Reserve will be there to buy them if private investors won't. This creates a feedback loop where spending drives borrowing. Borrowing drives money creation. And money creation enables more spending. The brilliant part of this system is that it looks legitimate. The Federal Reserve maintains the fiction that it operates independently from the Treasury. There are rules about not directly purchasing bonds from the government. There are procedures and protocols that make it appear as though market forces are at work. But strip away the complexity, and you'll see the truth. One part of the government is lending money to another part of the same government using money it creates for that purpose. This matters because it breaks the fundamental relationship between spending and earning that governs every other institution on Earth. When a business wants to expand, it has to either save money from profits or convince investors to provide capital. When a family wants to buy a house, they have to either save for a down payment or prove to a bank they can repay a loan. But when the government wants to spend money, it can simply issue bonds and have them purchased with newly created currency. Do you see the problem? The consequences ripple through the entire economy. When the Federal Reserve creates money to buy government bonds, that new money doesn't disappear. It flows into the banking system where it becomes the foundation for additional lending. Banks use those reserves to make loans to businesses and individuals, multiplying the effect of each dollar created. What started as digital entries on the Fed's balance sheet becomes mortgages, car loans, credit cards, and business investments throughout the economy. This is why asset prices have soared even as wages stagnated. This is why housing costs have exploded beyond the reach of ordinary families. This is why stock markets can reach record highs while small businesses struggle to survive. The new money doesn't distribute evenly. It flows first to those closest to the financial system, inflating the value of assets they already own while leaving everyone else to compete for goods and services with diluted currency. The bond trick isn't just an accounting gimmick. It's a wealth transfer mechanism that moves purchasing power from savers to spenders, from workers to asset owners, from the future to the present. And because most people don't understand how it works, they can't protect themselves from its effects. What about you? Are you ready for what happens next? The defenders of this system will tell you it's necessary. They'll explain that modern economies are too complex for simple rules about spending only what you earn. They'll point to economic theories that justify money creation as a tool for managing growth and preventing deflation. They'll argue that without this flexibility, governments couldn't respond to crises or fund essential services. But every justification misses the fundamental point. This system only works as long as people believe it works, and that belief is already cracking. When ordinary Americans watch their savings lose purchasing power while billionaires get richer, they're witnessing the bond trick in action. When young families can't afford homes their parents bought easily, they're feeling the effects of decades of money creation. When retirees discover their pensions buy less each year, despite promises of security, they're learning what happens when currency becomes a political tool rather than a store of value. The international dimension makes this even more dangerous. For decades, foreign governments have been willing participants in America's bond trick. They hold trillions in U.S. Treasury securities, effectively lending their own savings to fund American spending. But this arrangement only persists because the dollar serves as the world's reserve currency. Countries need dollars to buy oil, to settle international trade, to hold as reserves against their own currencies. What happens when that changes? What happens when major economies decide they no longer want to subsidize American deficit spending? What happens when the Federal Reserve's balance sheet becomes so bloated that even friendly nations start questioning whether those bonds will ever be repaid in currency worth anything? The answer is that America's ability to buy its own debt becomes not just an internal accounting trick, but a global economic weapon that can backfire spectacularly. China already understands this. Russia learned it the hard way through sanctions. Other nations are quietly building alternative payment systems, exploring digital currencies, and reducing their dependence on dollar-denominated assets. They're not doing this because they hate America. They're doing it because they recognize that any system allowing one country to create money to buy its own debt gives that country enormous power over everyone else forced to use that money. The mathematics of the bond trick are ultimately unsustainable. Every bond purchased with newly created money adds to the government's debt load, while simultaneously inflating the currency used to service that debt. As the debt grows, more bonds must be issued. As more bonds are issued, more money must be created to buy them. As more money is created, the purchasing power of each dollar declines, requiring even more bonds to fund the same level of government operations. This spiral accelerates during crisis when the Federal Reserve abandons all pretense of normal operations and directly monetizes government spending. The COVID response demonstrated this perfectly. Congress passed spending bills totaling trillions of dollars. The Treasury issued bonds to fund that spending. The Federal Reserve created money to buy those bonds. The entire process happened so quickly that there was no time for private investors to absorb the debt, even if they had wanted to. But the most insidious aspect of the bond trick isn't what it does to government finances. It's what it does to society. When money can be created at will to fund political priorities, The connection between taxation and representation breaks down. Politicians can promise expensive programs without raising taxes, knowing the Federal Reserve will monetize the difference. Voters can demand services without feeling the immediate cost, because that cost gets spread across all currency holders through inflation. This creates a dangerous feedback loop, where both politicians and voters lose touch with economic reality. Spending becomes divorced from earning. Promises become divorced from resources. The political system starts operating on the assumption that money is unlimited, even though the real resources that money represents are not. The bond trick has turned America into a financial magician, performing the same illusion over and over, each time with higher stakes and a more skeptical audience. The government writes itself checks. The Federal Reserve deposits them. And everyone pretends this is normal economics rather than the most sophisticated monetary deception in history. But every magic trick eventually gets exposed. And when this one does, it won't just be the magician who gets hurt. It will be everyone who believed the money in their wallet was real. Understanding the system isn't just about economics. It's about recognizing that your savings, your salary, and your future are all being quietly redistributed through a mechanism most people never see. What will you do tomorrow morning when you realize that every dollar in your wallet is part of the greatest financial magic trick in history? How will you protect your family when the trick gets exposed? Because it will be exposed. This isn't a question of if. This is a question of when. If this opened your eyes to what's really happening with your money, hit subscribe. The truth is hiding in plain sight. The only question is whether you're ready to see it.